Hello, I'm V.B. Price. I'm the editor of New Mexico Mercury. I'm here today with former U.S. Senator Fred Harris, two-time presidential candidate, almost vice presidential candidate for Hubert Humphrey, a UNM professor of political science, and a longtime hero to a great many of us. Our conversation will cover today his new ebook, written with one of New Mexico's greatest poets and novelists, Demetria Martinez, about immigration reform. It's called These People Want to Work. And I wanted to sort of tie that in a little bit, if we can, with the relationship to a populism of the left that's emerging as a new force in American politics. I'm hoping also that the senator will re-explore a little bit another populist issue in New Mexico in the 70s, which he helped solve with legislation, the returning of the sacred Blue Lake to Taos Pueblo. It's an honor to have you with us here today, Fred.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here, and you're doing a wonderful job with the Mercury.
This new book of yours is an e-Kindle book. I read it, and it's a heart-wrenching series of stories, but I wonder if you could describe for our readers and listeners the approach that you and Demetria took to explore this terrible plight of 11 million undocumented workers in the United States.
The problem of immigration reform, I think, and the plight of these undocumented workers who are here is, I think, the human rights, the civil rights issue of our time. And I wanted, and Demetria and I together wanted to try to get people to see this as a human problem, to think of the actual people, to sort of put faces on this issue and on these problems. So, and we decided to interview women. Women have special problems. They're often subject to much worse mistreatment and so forth. And it took us a while to gain the confidence of people, to find them and to get them to agree. And we told them, of course, that we're not ever going to reveal who you are, because all of them are, desperately worried about being deported, detained and deported in case they're found out. So that's what we did. We found about a dozen people. I think they're generally representative, and talked to them about their stories.
Your descriptions of the hardships that these women have had to suffer, the legal torments that they've gone through, the abandonments that they've suffered just to survive. Could you tell us some representative stories in pretty good detail about what it's actually like to be on this edge?
I think about two women in particular. They come to mind. We called them by different names, but they didn't know each other in Mexico. They grew up in Mexico City, middle-class families. They both had fairly good jobs, and then the jobs ran out. And so each of them separately agreed to pay a dentist in Mexico City $1,000. One of them paid $500 down, and the other paid $700 down, and they were to get a job in Albuquerque, they were told. They'd be sort of guided through the border in the desert in Arizona. And so it was a harrowing experience they had coming across that desert. In the last fiscal year here in the Arizona desert north of Nogales, more than 400 people died.
Oh, God.
It's a terrible thing. And these people were afraid they were abandoned by their coyote, the guy that's supposed to guide them, but finally did come and get them and bring them to Albuquerque, put them in a house here in Albuquerque where there were, I think, 10 men and one other woman, all in this kind of stashed there together, the terrible house. And the jobs that were waiting for them were pushing a cart and selling popsicles.
Oh, God.
But they went about it, and they were a little scared, to go out on the streets. They didn't know anybody. And eventually, though, they soon got a better job cleaning apartments for a guy who owned a bunch of apartments. And he helped to get them some fake documents. And then they both got jobs as stockers in a retail store here, all of them being paid, I think it was like $6.50 an hour, something like that, and no benefits or anything like that. There, the guy got scared, though, that La Migra, the immigration, was going to check the papers, so they lost those jobs, and they worked in a jewelry store for 7 years, making necklaces and so forth
God.
here. And then now what they do is landscaping. One woman learned to run a bobcat and work for a landscaping company, and the other cleans yards and so forth. And they've been here now about a dozen years, hardworking. Their ties to Mexico are gone, and of course they're here to stay. And desperately they want papers so that they can be here and work legally and not have to fear being deported. The best thing in their lives right now is they have hooked up with a local Catholic church, some nuns, and they volunteer in a program to help disabled people here in Albuquerque. That's I think, a wonderful story, and it's really sort of typical. They're both about 40 now. The average age of some of these 11 million people who are here without documents is not much below that, and they've been here a dozen years. The average undocumented person has been in the United States about 7 years. Here we're wasting this great human resource,
Yes.
And we're causing these people very, very often they're underpaid, and of course and often mistreated. They're threatened. We ran onto people who've been threatened by people, their employers, saying, well, if you try to go out on your own or whatever, I'll turn you into immigration. So it's a tough life, but you have to admire these people who are making it.
Could you talk a little bit more about the relationship between immigration reform and civil rights?
Yeah.
It seems like a very important connection needs to be made with the past in order to learn from the past, in order to help the present.
The Pew Foundation, probably the best study, shows that there's something like 11 million people who are here without documents. About 45% of them came legally. That is, they came on tourist visas or student visas or whatever, and then overstayed their visa.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So, this business about, well, if we can just lock down this border, this crazy thing of doubling all the amount of money we're spending, and then the personnel and so forth at the border, that somehow would stop the immigration. Actually, undocumented immigration is slowed already to a trickle for a number of reasons. But this is it seems to me really a civil rights issue. These people are treated like criminals, but they're not criminals.
Right.
But they're subject to being suddenly grabbed up, families broken up. We've had a number of those kind of cases where even sheriffs in 2 or 3 places have just raided a house, people's homes, took away the parents. The children born here are citizens, and carried them off, and they throw them, into these detention centers. We've got these sort of Kentucky Fried prisons that are privately owned, and they're thrown into these places. They run through detention courts like cattle. They're not entitled to a lawyer since they're not charged with a crime. They don't, unless we have a volunteer lawyer, and so it is really a thing of human rights. These people have come here to work, and they've come here to seek a better life, like so many people in the history of this country have done, and they want to work, and it would be an enormous asset for us here if we brought them out of the shadows. The estimate is by the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office that this, with the taxes that they would then pay, they're already paying a lot of taxes, but there's nothing been withheld oftentimes from income tax, And if they were if their status here were made legal and regular, as I said, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office says that would impact in the new revenues to the government would bring in about it would reduce our deficit by about $1 trillion in the next 10 years.
Wow. So people who work for immigration reform have a tremendous struggle with propaganda against immigration reform. Mm-hmm. And that propaganda, it seems to me, is composed of a number of very often repeated myths about immigration and about illegal immigrants. Could you talk a little bit about that and what those myths are?
There are some myths that are kicked around about undocumented people here, and about the need for immigration reform, or as I say, the need. And they are myths. For example, immigration from undocumented people has slowed to a trickle for a number of reasons. One is, and this is a really important thing, there are not as many people available to come here from Mexico now. Just a few years ago, the fertility rate in Mexico was such that the average woman had 7 children. Now that's down to 2. Wow. So we don't have a lot of those adolescent or early adulthood people who are available to come. Not only that, but Mexico's economy is doing very well. They're much better than ours. Right. And so people are finding jobs there. A big part of the people who are still coming, and there are not very many of them, are coming from Central America rather than Mexico. Right. And that's slowing down too, because a lot of them now are going south, down toward Brazil or Argentina or elsewhere, where the economies are much stronger than in the United States. So that's a myth. That is, that we're still got this flood of illegal immigrants. And there are a number of other myths. One is that they're responsible for a lot of crime, these undocumented workers. But the truth is that crime, violent crime, went down 1/3, and property crime 1/4 during the greatest influx of undocumented workers. Mm-hmm. And crime has been reduced most in the states where there are most undocumented workers.
Wow, that's a great step.
That just is a fact. Yeah. And the idea that they take jobs away from Americans or reduce wages is simply not true. We have a decreasing number of Americans who are willing to take a lot of these lower paid jobs. And not only that, but we would have an enormous boost in our economy if these people were out of the shadows and if they were able to be paid decent wages and not be mistreated, and then we would collect taxes for them and so forth. That would boost our economy, everybody says. We know for sure. And it would also shore up Social Security.
Oh, right.
So there are a lot of myths about these people, but they ought to be revealed for myths, untruths.
So we have many immigrants who came here as young people and are now dreaming to become citizens. It must be a terrible thing to be living in a world in which those dreams are sort of in a terrible tug of war, being torn apart by partisanship. Could you talk to us a little bit about the dream and what's possible here?
One of the young women that we interviewed for our book is a so-called dreamer, but she didn't know it. She grew up here. Her parents came up here, and they lived down in just south of the Arizona border in Mexico, and she came here as a kid, I think maybe 7 years old. She told me, and she was very good in school here in Albuquerque, and her dream was to get an engineering degree And her dream college, where she wanted to go to college, was Boulder, University of Colorado Boulder, for some reason. But then she decided that. Well, first of all, when she was filling out applications for to go there, her mother and father worked in a hotel here in Albuquerque, and of course they are undocumented people. So she said to her mother, "What's my social security number?" And her mother said, "Mija, you don't have a social security number."
Oh, God.
That's the first time she knew. She thought she was just like everybody else.
Oh, no.
She had no idea that she was not a citizen.
Oh, no.
But then, still though, she decided, I'm going to try to go to Boulder. But she said, she told her folks, if we were residents there, we'd have a lot less tuition to pay. So her parents said, we'll just move there. So they picked up and moved up to Colorado. She graduated. She went to her final year in high school there, and then she applied, and she found out that that in-state tuition rule did not apply to people who were undocumented.
Oh, God.
So then she said, well, let's go back down to Mexico. So they came back, New Mexico, came back down to Albuquerque, and they applied for admission to the University of New Mexico. And they said, well, wait a minute, you graduated from Colorado High School. And they said, well, yes, but that was, our permanent residence has always been in New Mexico. We just went up there temporarily, which was true. And so they admitted her here, but she was not eligible for a lottery scholarship because she did not graduate from a New Mexico school. Well, she's just a terrific student, a great record. She has been working as a work-study person for nothing because they couldn't pay her because she's not documented,
God.
doesn't have a work permit.
Oh, dear.
President Obama, as you know, issued an executive order deferring any deportation of those kind of dreamers, as they're called, for 2 years. But I'm worried about them, and a lot of them have applied and so forth, and they're getting this kind of temporary residence. But I'm worried about them because suppose Congress doesn't pass the law which makes that apply by law rather than by executive order, they have revealed themselves, and they're going to be, suppose you get a new president or...
oh, yeah, right. They're just sitting ducks.
Yes. So it's a really tough thing. I'm hopeful, and I kind of believe that the Republicans are going to come around in the House at least to give them permanent residence, those dreamers.
Well, why do you think the House is going to suddenly have a conscience?
The Senate, as you know, has passed immigration reform, and it's got some stuff in it we don't particularly like, but we're hopeful, as John McCain even has said, that at least in conference, if we ever get it through the House in some fashion, we can take out some of that bad stuff. But it's a terrific development that the Senate's passed it. The House is really tough. Nationally, the national leaders of the Republican Party see the handwriting on the wall, and they can count. Hispanics are the fastest growing minority in America. They're the largest minority in America. There are 50 million of them, 16% of our population. They gave 71% of their votes among those who voted for Obama. And the national Republican leaders who think in terms of running for president or electing a president see that they're going to have to change. I don't know. It's on this and a number of other things, though, like women's rights and so forth. There's an old adage that political parties in the past have, if they had a choice of dying or changing and reforming themselves, have chosen death. and that's what you're afraid of about the House of Representatives. Yeah. Only about 25% of the Republican members of the House have districts where Hispanics amount to 15% or more of their voters. and or their population, and about the same percentage, only about 25 House seats are held by Republicans in a district that Obama carried. So a majority of those House members don't have the same view that national Republicans have, or a majority of the American population are in favor of immigration reform and in favor of this, of doing something about these dreamers in particular. And Speaker Boehner, though, has indicated that this time, they voted it down once before, the Republicans in the House, that at least they'll probably go with the regularizing the residents of the dreamers, at least. I'm hoping that they'll pass something, and then we can come with a conference bill that will take care of the entire problem.
In your presidential campaigns in 72 and 76, your two mottos were economic democracy and privilege is the issue.
Right.
As I read this particular book, it seems to me that these two mottos are more relevant even now than they used to be. Economic democracy is impossible when you're paying wages that cannot possibly support anyone without doing 80 hours or 120 hours a week. And privilege is the issue because so many of us in our country don't understand or can't see past their privilege of the terrible problems. Could you talk about that a little bit?
I grew up in the state, Oklahoma, where at statehood, the Democrats were really, the Democratic Party was about third. First were the populists, and second the socialists, and then the Democrats really were about third. And so I've kind of stayed with that populist idea just from growing up. It's not exactly a New Deal kind of liberalism. It says which some people talk about people ought to help other people because it's their moral duty. I think that what we ought to do is think about our own self-interest. I think most people would be willing to pay their fair share of taxes and so forth if their own situation were looked at. You take a guy like my dad. I've served on the President's National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, the Kerner Commission, and we said, among other things, America's moving toward two societies, one white, one black, separate and unequal. Yeah. Well, my dad's a small farmer in southwestern Oklahoma. He loves me, or did. He's passed away now, and he had about a third grade education. But the way he heard what we said, the Kerner Commission said, was, Mr. Harris, you ought to pay more taxes to help black people in Detroit. And he's thinking to himself, well, hell, I'm already paying too much tax, which was true, and not getting a whole lot out of it. And so populism says what we've got to do, we've got to attack concentrated economic power, which translates into concentrated political power.
Yes.
So when I was running for president, what I talked about was that we've got to have a fairer distribution of wealth and income and power in this country. And inequality already was terrible, and of course it's gotten much worse. Well, I think Occupy Wall Street, that effort, has sort of put inequality of income and wealth much more on the public agenda. I think there's a good deal more talk about that. And people, I think, more and more see that you really can't run a democracy with all of the power and wealth and income concentrated in the upper 1%. It just won't work. Daniel Webster said that democracy depends upon nobody being so rich as to be able to buy other people, and nobody being so poor as to have to sell. And I think that's exactly right. And that's what Obama stands for and more talks about. and I hope that the American people will more and more have their will felt in that regard.
So I just heard that Jim Hightower was your campaign manager, and I'm wondering if you have a tale or two to tell us about the two of you guys getting together in those days and talking about these matters.
Hightower, I first knew Jim Hightower when he was worked for the sainted Ralph Yarborough, a senator from Texas, and then he formed a Nader-like group, the Agribusiness Accountability Project, and we worked together in a lot of things. And he was my campaign manager. The late Fort Worth Star Telegram one time asked him, "Is it true that you were the campaign manager for Fred Harris for president?" And Hightower said, "That's true." He said, "I made him what he is today, a college professor." Hightower and I, we had a lot of fun. Yeah, both of us have the, as tough as things are, there isn't any reason why you can't laugh a little bit. And I was telling some people the other day, one time we had a big meeting, outdoor meeting, hot summer day in Lincoln, Nebraska, presidential campaign. And Hightower, as usual, master of ceremonies, and he introduced me. And he said, there's a bunch of old farmers sitting right out front there. And when they took the tractor caps off, there's sort of the white, foreheads or this. And they were all sitting there right in front. And Hightower said, "Ours is a campaign of issues. Our candidate is not just another pretty face, as you can plainly see." and these old farmers sitting there in front saying, "Well, he's right about that." Hightower turned around to me and he said, "Friend, I think we've stumbled into a Lloyd Benson meeting." But Hightower's the best populist I know, and he was Secretary of Agriculture in Texas, and he now is, got a populist newsletter, and radio programs and so forth, and believes in the same things I do about economic democracy.
So, is there a younger, new kind of populism in America, and does it arise out of the multiple, endless injustices laid upon minorities and women in America?
Right.
Where is the new populism?
There is I think now on the public agenda, more than at any time in the last 50 years, this idea about the terrible inequality of wealth and income. I mean, we're like a third world country, here's the 1%, and you look at how virtually all of the growth in income in this country in the last 15, 20 years has gone to the top. And the ordinary people, middle class people and below, have actually seen a reduction in their income. And how's that brought about? Well, because we've given all these tax breaks to the rich, and we've given them all sorts of subsidies and so forth. One of the things that I said back when I was running for president was, and I had a button, somebody found one the other day, that said, "Take the rich off welfare." With the subsidies and with the tax breaks and so forth, with letting the minimum wage now be almost meaningless insofar as being able to make a living, we have greatly skewed income and wealth in this country. And that Occupy Wall Street was a kind of a spontaneous thing that grew up. Some people said it's like the Tea Party on the other side, but it wasn't, in that it didn't have a electoral purpose. Right. They didn't hook it in with elections and so forth, and that's been one of the problems we've had with this idea of populism, about doing something about concentrated economic and political power. A lot of people, if you look all around the country, you find that locally there are just millions and millions of people who are involved in things, taking on the local public utility or redlining housing areas and so forth. And they're doing all sorts of populist things. Yeah. But if you could just sort of connect the dots. Jim Hightower, my old campaign manager and very close friend, he's got a new book coming out that talks about that. We've got to get all of these people together and get them to see that, you've got to connect it into elections, campaigns. I know. For example, at the University of New Mexico, I'm sure that well over half of the students are involved in some kind of service activities.
I think that's true.
But most of them not very interested in politics or elections. And, for example, they go and work in a kitchen that gives food to the poor, but they need to think about, how come there's so damn many poor people? Why is it we've got so many people that are hungry? You've got to do something about the policy. And that I think is the only way you can do that, is mobilize people, is in a campaign. And when I was the national chairman of the Democratic Party, I appointed the McGovern Commission, George McGovern, the chair, and made up the membership of the commission in such a way as to assure the reforms they came up with to make the Democratic Party really democratic. Representation of women and of minorities and open meetings and so forth, so that it would be an instrument for attacking economic and political power concentration. And I think we've done that. But you've got to use politics and government, and campaigns and government to try to put these policies into practice.
So populism is almost always a local matter. And I suppose the big problem is trying to turn it into a national matter. But I know in 1970, of all people, President Nixon signed into law a bill that you sponsored in the Senate to return Blue Lake, the sacred Blue Lake, to Taos Pueblo. A highly localized, but I look at it as a populist kind of issue. You had to battle against Clinton Anderson, I know, and others in the West in order to have this happen. Could you talk about that a little bit in the light of our discussion?
Theodore Roosevelt, President of the United States, just by executive order, no law, no act of Congress, just took all this land from Taos Pueblo, belonged to them, including the 48,000 acres where their sacred Blue Lake lands are, took it over and made it into a national forest. Well, the Congress eventually set up a court of claims for tribes who had had their land illegally taken. And the court of claims ruled that was illegal. And they they were going to award damages in money based upon the value of the land back when it was taken.
Wow.
And and a lot of tribes took the money. But one time when I was in the Senate, in the U.S. Senate, there were 5 old leaders of Taos Pueblo who came to see me, the old cacique, who already was maybe then 80 years old. All of them are dead now. They came, they spoke to me through an interpreter, and told me that they'd been fighting for years and years and years to say, no, we don't want the money, we want the land. And they convinced me that that the Blue Lake and those lands were really sacred to them and central to their culture and their religion. And I said to a young fellow who was working for me, a staff member, Fred Gibson, when they left, I said, if we don't do another damn thing while we're here, let's see if we can't get their land back for these people. We had a really good friend in the White House who'd been a White House fellow. Bobby Kilberg was her name, and got her involved. She was already interested in Indian affairs and so forth, and wound up getting Nixon's staff to support this. This was a way to do something for Indians. It didn't cost any money. And so in the Senate, however, the Democrats were in control of the Senate, and Senator Jackson of Washington was chairman of the Senate Interior Committee, that jurisdiction, And Senator Anderson was the senior senator on that committee from New Mexico. He already was suffering from Parkinson's disease, but you could tell the way people treated him that he had been and still was an enormous power in the Senate. And I wasn't a member of the Interior Committee, but I had already told them we're going to try to do this and give back the land. And so the Democrats on the committee, Jackson and Anderson, had me come into a private meeting where they thought put the pressure on me, and Jackson he started the meeting, but then he turned it over to Senator Anderson, and Senator Anderson said to me, "We'll give them a use permit." That's what my bill was. They can use the land every now and then and do their sacred ceremonies, but not title to it, not ownership, control of it. And he said, he said to me, if you don't agree to support my bill, why, you won't get anything. So I said, in the Senate, I was fairly new to the Senate, but I knew the Senate rules, and anything, you can offer an amendment to anything. It doesn't even have to be on the same subject.
Right.
I said to him, Senator, I'm going to make the Senate vote on this. Whatever you bring out, I'm going to make the Senate vote on my amendment, and whatever you bring out. And so that's what eventually I did. And we got a lot of church groups and other Indian groups and women's groups and so forth mobilized, and we had the White House staff for this. Although Jackson and Anderson went to Nixon and said, "We won't support you on this anti-ballistic missile program." Really?
Really?
If you don't back off of this. And he thought about doing it, as the White House staff people have said publicly, including Bobby Kilberg. Well, we came up on the Senate floor, him still in the saddle, Nixon, not backing out, although he wanted to. And I was always pretty tough in debate. I'd been a lawyer, and I didn't mind debating Scoop Jackson, but I worried about Anderson. He's, as I said, already suffering from Parkinson's disease, and sure enough, right in the middle of my speech, he got up and in a very tremulous voice, and he said, "Would I yield for a question?" And so I said, "Yes, I'll yield." And I thought to myself, I've got to be nice. So I said, "Yes, I'll yield." So the first question, when he asked me something, I didn't understand it, and almost panicked. I didn't understand what he said. So I moved closer to him. I said, "Would the senator repeat his question?" And he said this time, "What about the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo?" It actually is a pretty good question. It's the basis, I know now, of land titles in New Mexico. But I come from Oklahoma, I had never heard of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So here we are on the Senate floor debate. Senator Anderson says, "What about the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo?" I said, "What about it?" And poor old Senator Anderson talked about it for about 15 minutes. Nobody understood him. And we voted and we passed my bill. The Taos people are the most generous, wonderful people, and they've had I don't know how many different kind of ceremonies in Taos saying thank you again. It's sort of the gift that keeps on giving.
Oh, God, I want
And they say to me, "May the spirit of Blue Lake be a blessing to you." And it certainly has been.
So it seems like populism is indeed all wrapped up in politics, its root word. So if we're talking about immigration reform, and we must talk about it as a national issue, but it's a national issue that deals with thousands and thousands of local problems, intractable problems often. What is the solution to? Is there a populist solution to immigration reform? Is there a way to get enough of a boiling of opinion and sentiment behind this thing to get it going?
Well, I think the immigration reform is a populist issue because what we've got here, 11 million people one study shows, I guess the best study, are powerless politically, and they're powerless economically, and they're in many ways a terribly wasted asset for the rest of us. Right. It's not good for us to have these 11 million people who are subject to mistreatment and who are not able to make a living as they should. They're sort of permanent subclass in this country. That's not good for the rest of us. No. So when the Senate has passed immigration reform, that's good news for these people, and it's good news for the rest of us as well. I think, and the American people know that. The polls all show that the American people are for giving these people here who've been working hard, who pay their taxes, who haven't been in trouble with the law. We ought to welcome them here. Yeah. They're well-motivated people, and somebody says, well, they don't assimilate. They do. They assimilate rapidly in this country. For example, on language, the first generation, struggling to learn the language, and we ought to make that easier for them. We ought to have programs like we did once before for that. But second generation is speaking both languages. The third generation can't talk to grandpa. That's a damn shame in a way, that they're not bilingual. A lot of them are not. But they those immigrants, undocumented immigrants, they wind up, their children, doing better education, better jobs, better income than the average person in America. They assimilate well. They believe in all of the things that other Americans believe in. And we need these people. That, I think, is going to become increasingly obvious. It's not good politics for the Republicans to fight this, given the growing number of Hispanics and Hispanic voters in this country, and the great majority of them support immigration reform. But we need them for another reason. We're not reproducing ourselves, us non-Hispanic white people in America. We're not for example, over half of the population growth in recent times in the United States is coming from Hispanic families, and that's going to continue. We're looking at a situation now where our workforce, since the fertility rate in the United States is going down for native-born people, our workforce is increasing only by about 1% a year. That's what we're facing now, while the people we need for jobs is going to continue to go up, particularly as this economy gets better. And so we need both to shore up Social Security, for example, more people paying into the system, and also to fill these jobs. We're going to need immigrants. We ought to regularize that system. We ought to decide on how many we need, and we ought to welcome them here. And the people that are already here, we ought to have Americanization programs for language, for civic education, and so forth. There's no reason not to. And I think eventually we're going to see, all of us, I hope, that is in our best interest.
So as the Buddha says, I guess compassion is always in our own interests as well as in the interests of other people. Thank you, Fred, for being here with us. It's been an honor and a joy, and we've all learned a tremendous amount, and had a great time doing it.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.